Hi there. My name is Dan Greening. I'm the host of the Mindful Agility podcast. I did a talk recently with the Scrum Inc. trainer community. In that talk, I explained what the purpose of the Mindful Agility group was, how we were thinking about Agile, and how we were thinking about mindfulness in the context of businesses. This session was addressed to Scrum trainers. Scrum trainers generally focus on cost saving activities in teams. I hope you find this useful, and I'm happy to answer questions that are raised when you listen to this session. That benefits me because it helps me think about what I need to explain to folks who are first approaching Agile. Thanks. Here we go. I have a consulting company called Cenex Rex. Over the past, I would say 3 years, I've been primarily doing pro bono work and doing research in mindful agility. And so Alex and I thought it might be good for me to give you an idea of what we're up to. Our mission is to help more people live more fulfilled lives. So that's a big mission, and we will narrow that down a bit. But it is my contention, it's been my contention for a long time that Agile has many benefits outside software technology. And of course, we're seeing that now with its use in hardware and other sectors. But I think it applies generally to anything involving creative work, even individuals doing creative work, but of course, teams doing creative work. It occurred in software first because that was one of the most expensive areas where creative work was organized. But when you look at applying Agile elsewhere, it applies anywhere in those areas. Mindfulness, on the other hand, just seems like something out of left field. But one of the issues that I noticed from the very beginning of my involvement with Agile was the fragility of Agile, that some companies would do Agile transformations and then they would regress. And that regression just seemed ludicrous to me, given the numbers that the profits increased and that cost reduced, that quality was improved. So I wanted to investigate that. What has happened perhaps in the last 4 or 5 years is I've really gotten into mindfulness, and this is more of an individual activity. Today, we see mindfulness meditation being used all over the place. Neurologists in particular are fascinated by it, and there are many recent scientific studies showing the psychological benefits and health benefits of mindfulness. I started working with Marilla Patali a year and a half ago. She is a neurocritical care nurse, instructor. She's also a meditation guide. And we've had lots of conversations about how Agile could benefit from mindfulness and how mindfulness could also benefit from Agile. We'll talk about that in a second. Over the 2022 year, we've recruited a couple of buddies to help us with this. We started with a podcast to talk about business settings and personal settings and family settings where mindfulness plus agility could benefit people's lives or businesses. I want to give some definitions. I like to define Agile myself because if I use the Agile Manifesto, we end up spending a lot of time talking about software. I did something called the Agile Canon, which is a set of really basic patterns about Agile. What characterizes things that are Agile? There are links at the end of this presentation you can look at if you'd like to see those patterns. But basically, Agile is rapid, iterative, adaptive experimentation. It turns out Scrum is exactly that. It's Agile for creative work. So the intent is to reduce the cost of producing something. We do spend time talking about product ownership, and in those sessions, we talk about various ways to improve the value of the product that you're producing. But the predominant work that we do in Scrum is about cost reduction for the purpose of serving a particular product goal. Some people do talk about lean startup in their product owner sessions. I do, of course. It is Agile for market discovery. So it is rapid, iterative, adaptive experimentation, looking at where is the market? What features do these people want? And doing it in as cheaply and rapidly as possible. So there's other Agile things. There's Agile in education. There's lean manufacturing. All of these are a variant of Agile, but they optimize for different things. Mindfulness, on the other hand, kind of a complete shift here, is a way for people to have faster insights through objective awareness. The way people achieve that, there are many ways, but one of the ways that almost everybody is familiar with is mindfulness meditation, where we practice focusing on our breath, trying to control our minds, but in a kind of oblique way, to bring our attention to our breath. We constantly have the monkey mind where we're thinking about what we have to make for dinner, how we had a fight with our boss. All those things intrude on our ability to focus. Those things also intrude on our ability to focus on Agile things that we're trying to get done. So there is value in having mindfulness with you when you're doing Agile. We have inner impediments that get in our way of getting things done. When we're prideful, we get arrogant and we assume that our intuition is going to create value for us. But of course, we've seen many train wrecks when people get too prideful. When people get angry, they lash out, and it may be completely an impediment to you succeeding. We see CEOs having all of these emotions, and these emotions, I've seen them lead to the destruction of Agile in either a part of a company or sometimes a whole company. When people do things rapidly without thinking much, that's called reactivity. The opposite of that is something called self-regulation. And self-regulation is something that's been shown over and over again that mindfulness practices improve self-regulation. One of the things that people don't realize that mindfulness includes is a bunch of other practices outside meditation. One of those is deep causal analysis. Buddhism is a place where mindfulness is done. I happen to adopt many of the Buddhist philosophies, but I am something called a secular Buddhist, which means I don't believe in any religious elements of Buddhism, no mystical anything. But the practices have been in place for 2,500 years, and those practices were developed to solve a goal, which was to reduce suffering in individuals and others. To understand suffering, it benefits from something that we call 5 whys. This idea where there is suffering and you ask why, and then you get an immediate answer, an intuitive answer, and then you say, okay, well, why is that answer true? And you keep following through until you get a chain at least 5 whys long. But you can create more than that. You can say, well, there are many intuitive answers for why they're suffering or why we had a bad part in our factory floor. And you end up with a giant map of reasons. This is something that is done in mindfulness practice. It's sometimes done in meditation and sometimes just done as thought experiments. If you think about Japan. If you think about Toyota as the place where 5 Whys was invented, it was invented by a bunch of Zen Buddhists, basically, because that is a dominant religion there. And Taiichi Ono was a Zen dude. All right, so what does that have to do with work? So mindful work is happening now. If you are involved with any first responders, you will hear them talk about situational awareness. They get into a situation and their first goal is to get a big picture analysis of everything that is happening. Our common sense approach in going into these crazy crises is to focus solely on, the train wreck. But first responders are trained to look openly around them and to apply this causal analysis to understand what the things they're seeing and what caused them so that they can intercede to prevent further damage and to hopefully save the people who are there. There was some studies at the University of Michigan in the mid-2000s, and those continue, talking about mindful organizations. So those guys were looking for companies that looked deeply at their processes to determine whether their processes were really helping. It turned out the ones that did that the most were high reliability organizations. So medicine, it's used in nuclear power operation. It's also a characteristic of NASA these days after various problems. Preoccupation with failure, which is one of the principles of these mindful organizations, is to lean into failure, to say, we had a failure, let's not avert our eyes about that failure, which is a human nature characteristic. Instead, let's look deeply at that failure without fear to understand what was actually happening and how we might prevent that in the future. I've been preoccupied with Scrum failure since, like I said, virtually the beginning. I was working with Jeff on various things, and we wrote a couple of papers together. In those conversations with him, I kept saying, it sure seems like Yahoo. They lost their Agile practice, their Scrum practice, time after time, multiple times. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. It has such great benefits. Why is this happening? That is leaning into failure. That idea that you're going, something's weird here. What can we learn? I just wrote a paper on learning from failure. And it turns out psychologically, it's actually very difficult for us to learn from failure. Our first reaction is to run. When we have any kind of failure, we just don't want to think about it. And then the second thing that people often do is they spend a lot of time in regret, blaming themselves. Both of those get in the way of spending time really understanding what's going on. There's a couple of real examples that you know of. Certainly everybody's seen kung fu movies where the fighters are getting together and they meditate prior to a big fight. And even in the middle of the fight, you'll see this stop action Hong Kong film stuff where the fighters go into slow-mo and then it's very meditative. That is a real thing. That was Shaolin monks about 500 years ago. They were Zen Buddhists, or Chan Buddhists, as it's said in China. They do something called fighting meditation. They incorporate meditation into their action practice. Lastly, I'll talk about Salesforce.com. It was one of the earliest adopters of a scaled Scrum approach. They did Scrum throughout the organization in, I think, 2005. More recently, they have what I think is an emerging mindfulness culture. So this may relate to Mark Benioff, the CEO of Salesforce. I think he's a secular Buddhist too, because they put meditation rooms in every floor. He's kind of a fan of Thich Nhat Hanh. If you do a search on Mark Benioff, and Thich Nhat Hanh, you'll find some nice stories, or if you talk to me, I can tell you that story too. Here are some challenges that the other approach provides. Agile for unskilled practitioners. Of course, if we're skilled Agilists, we're going to actually adopt some mindfulness practices in our Agile practice because we got to have it, right? So with Agile, if you're just applying things by rote, you have issues of anxiety. Oh my God, our sprint cycle is so short, we can't get anything done. You're busy doing metrics and our standard approaches to failure. For example, if you're trying to get a velocity, and if you constantly fail, you're going to stop worrying about your velocity instead of looking deeply into it to figure out what you can do, adjust the way you're thinking about velocity. We also have cognitive biases. We layer some practices into that. So for example, when we do story point estimation, people often avoid anchor bias by a Delphi approach, I think. It's also fragile. It's this idea that Agile sometimes gets booted out of an organization. Those things happen when there are unskilled practitioners in Agile. When there are unskilled practitioners in mindfulness, we have a different set of problems. We get sloth. So people start meditating. They finally get rid of all this anxiety that is built up. They're getting less reactive. They're getting more self-regulated. They're walking comfortably into confusing, chaotic situations. And they don't do a whole lot, right? Like, so this is why, I don't know, like Buddhist monks, it just seems crazy to me. You solve all these problems with your own reactivity, and then you sequester yourself in this little monastery somewhere and don't do anything to reduce the suffering of other people. So that is kind of an unskillful mindfulness. There is an ambition aversion for unskilled mindfulness people. People who are seeking success, they have a dim view of that. Even if the success is helping more people eat better or healthier food or something like that, there's just this weird thing there. It does concentrate on individuals as a model, and people who are unskilled have a tendency to not take risks, which is kind of a funny thing. So the combination is Agile, it's insight. If you incorporate mindfulness practices, a bunch of great things from that. Mindfulness gets impact. There is this notion of reducing suffering that is the motivator for the original conception of mindfulness. Having more impact in that area means that you should run a bunch of experiments to figure out if you can improve more lives. Discovery through experimentation is not a mindfulness thing. They could really use it. So that creates active discovery. You have more ambitious goals about making better lives. That all sounds very theoretical. We're actually trying to figure out what is actually real. We recognize that this is a crazy idea. So in 2001, we said, this could be an idea, but it could be crazy and we could waste a lot of time. And Morella said, let's do it. So we did. So we created a podcast and we are talking with different people about individual problems, but we're also talking through business issues and we're leaning into failure somewhat. So we had 3 episodes on a famous CEO, Ron Johnson, who was the person who created the modern Target store and the Apple store. He designed Apple stores and then got very prideful. He didn't get the CEO role at Apple. He said, well, I'm going to go out on my own. JCPenney was having trouble, hired him thinking he would be a miracle worker. And he walked into JCPenney with that in mind himself. It was a train wreck. There was another train wreck. We talk about how he did not use Agile practices in rolling out his projects, and he wasn't very mindful either. And what would have happened if he did that? But there's a bunch of other stuff in that podcast. lately, we're doing more writing. I historically have this Agile canon set of patterns, but some of them lean into mindfulness already because I was writing patterns about successful Agile implementations without regard to specifics of Scrum, for example, or other things like that. What were the things in Agile that led to success? That was what those patterns were. And so mindfulness was part of that, it turned out. One of the things we're thinking about is Scrum meeting rituals. This seems a bit crazy to me, but also I'm not really afraid of experimenting. So we are starting to experiment with starting meetings with very short meditations or very short reminders of what this meeting is for. Those are going to be like 5 minutes for a regular meeting, and for a stand-up, it'll probably be 1 or 2 minutes, but something super short, but to at least bring our minds to focus on the issues we're trying to deal with at this meeting. Not necessarily the issues, but the way we should be thinking during those meetings. And the last thing we're doing is reminding ourselves that it's okay to be crazy. We're loving the process. We're using Scrum. We have 1-week sprints. We deliver something to customers who give us feedback every single sprint. The podcast is now in the top 10th percentile of podcasts, so that's kind of nice. It's still a work in progress, and it's pretty rough, but if you're interested, check into it. Here's some information about us. There's a Mindful Agility podcast. We have posts on the site. I have this pattern language of agility that I'm starting to get re-engaged in. It was developed around 2013, but I'm starting to work on it more. And you can connect with me this way. I guess that's it. Should I ask for questions here?
Yeah, are there any burning questions for Dan? Thank you, Dan, by the way, that was awesome.
Let me put in one more pitch. One of the things that I am doing is pro bono training. That means training for free. So if any of you as trainers encounter nonprofit groups or are serving underprivileged folks and you want some co-training help or you want to collaborate on something like that, I am super game for stuff like that. I did 2 pro bono trainings in 2022, and I'm hoping to do more in 2023.
All right, looks like Thorolf has a question or comment on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a good segue to that. It would be an awesome match, I think, for the Scrum Master at Scale training, which Christoph Dibban and I may be setting up for April-May timeframe. So
Okay.
the mindfulness and servant leadership at scale is an awesome combination. You could just join our volunteer training group.
I would love to do that.
Then I wanted to share a mental image when you said regression.
Okay.
I saw a heat map that turns red and everyone runs away instead of dealing with it.
Yeah, that's it, right? Agile exposes all these failure modes.
So the question is, why is there no scaffolding framework to keep the people busy fixing it? But why do they run away or divest in Agile courses? The other bridge I had was to the Agile leader at scale. All the challenges you mentioned on both sides really are awesome opportunities for leadership to provide an environment where those things don't happen. And early, and Scrum at Scale does, right? We know. So early already support all these challenges. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, no, I think those are really great thoughts. One of the things that I've seen, and I think everybody else has seen too, is if you get a leader, a CEO, to really understand the nature of Agile itself and the benefits that confer from it, and they believe in it, you will have no problems keeping Agile in your organization. But this is also true with mindfulness. Having that sort of mindfulness means that the CEO is leaning into failure, is leaning into issues and trying to understand what's happening without fear. And so that behavior leads to the followers, the people under that person in the hierarchy of the organization going, oh, if that person can do that, I could do that too. And so I'll just lean into my failures. I'm hoping to start interacting more with folks at salesforce.com because I'd like to understand how their mindfulness affects their work. And I don't know that yet. Okay, that's it.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you. This is a really inspiring conversation, honestly, and a great reminder that we need to be looking both at our successes, but really at the failures. So thank you so much for that, Dan. I've really enjoyed the podcast that you put out.
Oh, okay. Thanks.